Recently, I went and saw the iconic 1939 film Gone with the Wind on the big screen as it celebrated its 85-year anniversary. It's during this nearly 4-hour-long epic that Rhett Butler, played by Clark Gable, has multiple encounters with a lady by the name of Belle Watling, a character played by actress Una Munson. Here, we see them together in objectively one of the greatest films ever made. But there's more that connected these two actors than just this movie. And that connection was not related to Hollywood, as one might assume, but rather a connection to, of all places, Portland, Oregon. Just for the record, I first covered this connection in a video back in 2017 that bombed in terms of views. In this, I delve a bit deeper into the elements of this story, but the clips you see of me on the scene are those same ones taken back in 2017. Clark Gable, one of classic Hollywood's most recognizable faces. Born in 1901, he'd seen a lot in his early years before heading west to Oregon at the start of the 1920s. While here, he took up numerous jobs from hop picker to sawmill worker to working for the Oregonian newspaper. But during all of this, he was discovering his true talent, acting. He would perform out of Portland and Astoria. There's even a long since vacant Masonic temple, empty since 1981 after being damaged by a fire, to the north end of town where he'd performed, and that building still stands today. During Gable's short time in Portland before striking it big in Hollywood, he lived in multiple places, including the Wickersham Apartments west of the downtown area. But for our sake, for a time, Gable also lived near the intersection of 13th and West Burnside. This here is the intersection of 13th Avenue and Burnside being the crossing road right here. Now, as the story goes, back around 1920 to maybe 1922 or so, Clark Gable lived just off 13th and Burnside, the lead actor from Gone with the Wind. So literally, he lived right in this. There's an old brick building on the other side of this black one over there that looks like it might be a really old apartment house. Just as well, wherever he lived near this intersection, the building could very easily be gone. This was almost 100 years ago. So when Clark Gable was working here, struggling actor, and he was working at the Meyer and Frank building towards Pioneer Courthouse Square, selling ties and probably doing a damn good job about it, he was living literally right here. And of a more interesting note, in terms of 13th and Burnside, this black building behind me on the second floor, that's where the famous recording of the song Louie Louie by the Kingsmen was recorded. So this is a very historical intersection. And that being said, I'm going to take you guys on a short little journey. And you guys are probably wondering, like, Steve, what are you doing? Where are you going? Like, why would you take us away from that intersection back there? All right? I mean, you've got Clark Gable and Louie Louie within feet of each other, and we just get to see it for a second, and then we move on? Yes. I'm gonna move on from there. And it's a short trip, don't worry about it. I'm just walking one block down to 13th and Washington, and then I'm hooking a sharp turn, going towards some more businesses here, into the heart of the city. And then I'm gonna maybe take my life into my own hands a little bit. Across the street. It's a very short trip, I promise you. Let the wind hit my face a little bit. Venture around. Let some more wind hit me in the face. Get to check out these cool old buildings down here. Cool old buildings all over this place. And literally crossing another intersection. This is 12th and Washington. I'm literally like one square block down from where Clark Gable lived. And again, you're probably like, where the hell are you taking me, Steve? Give me a break. Well, I'm taking you to, well, I guess right about here is as good as any. Because this little black building right here over my shoulder, the site that is now this tiny little black building is the approximate address to where a family that went by the name Wolcott lived in circa 1910. Now the Wolcotts had multiple children, but one of them was named Una Wolcott. And Una Wolcott, almost 20 years later, moved to Hollywood and went by another name. That name was Una Munson. Born in 1903, despite some claims that it was 1906, Una Munson, born Owena Wolcott, grew up in Portland, attending the city's private Gable school. Her father ran a hat-making business on Jersey Street in the St. John's area, ultimately expanding to multiple locations. I found a few references to Owena in newspapers, including one where she gave such an impressive dance performance at the city's armory that the audience begged her for an encore, and she was only too happy to oblige. It should shock no one then that by the age of 16, in 1919, this little girl would make her arrival on Broadway and go by a different name. After briefly moving to LA to pursue film acting at the start of the 1930s, Una Munson returned to the stage before scoring her most famous role, Belle Watling in Gone with the Wind. The role was a blessing and a curse, leaving Munson typecast in future films, the last of which being The Red House in 1947. She would take her own life in 1955 by an overdose of barbiturates. She left a note behind that read, "This is the only way I know to be free again. Please don't follow me." And while Una was still Owena, her family was living on 12th Avenue between Washington and Alder Streets, in a relatively nice rooming house that once stood there. But this is not the only place where her family lived in town. Later, they would relocate just a little further south. Now the house standing behind me, that is the Morris Marks house. I believe built in like 1880, it was a really long time ago. And last fall, 2017, this house was in danger of being demolished, and they actually decided to split the home in half and move it on some big trucks from its original site to where it now stands, and assuming they're going to clean it up and make it look nice again. But the Morris Marks house, and more importantly its initial location where it used to be, a little further that way, is prominent in this overall story. And I'm going to show you why now. So I'm now on 12th Avenue in downtown Portland, and as I said before, while at one time Una Munson and Clark Gable, their homes were within 2 blocks of each other, they didn't live in those places at the same time. Clark Gable lived there in the early 1920s, and that location right around the corner is where Una Munson lived when she was a child. However, I'm going to the location she lived at during the early 1920s, which would be where she was in relation to when Clark Gable actually lived here. And it's still very interesting how close they were together. So here is the Morris Marks house when I caught some video footage of it a little over a year ago, when I noticed it was fenced up and potentially ready for demolition. And here is the site now where the house used to be. You'll notice, obviously, it's an empty plot right now. They're going to build something else here. But what's interesting when referencing the historical implications of the Marks house, the fact that it was right here, is the fact that where Una Munson lived in 1920, right about the time Clark Gable came to Portland, was this apartment house right next door. Today, the address of this apartment house is 1146 Southwest 12th Avenue. When Una Munson lived here, it was, 258 12th Avenue. There wasn't even a Southwest at that time, and there's a very good reason for that. What really came into play when I was trying to put this together was I'm dealing with addresses that are from the 1910s and 1920s, which is a complicated thing, or I'm trying to determine whether these addresses I'm finding are before or after 1930. Now, the reason I needed to figure that out is because in the city of Portland, and if you're trying to work with addresses historically in the Portland area, this is always going to come up for you. In 1930, Portland completely reconfigured their citywide structure, which meant reestablishing neighborhoods, reestablishing addresses, so to speak. So after 1930, pretty much every address changed and the whole town was reclassified. So that was when there was finally an establishment of a Northwest Portland, a Northeast Portland, a Southwest Portland, a Southeast Portland, and a North Portland. And fortunately, one of the things that cinched it for me, that especially in the case of Una Munson, when I was looking at her address for her home that was only less than 2 blocks from where Clark Gable was living, was her address was 129 and a half 12th Avenue. Now, after 1930, half addresses ceased to exist. But beyond that, even though I was able to firmly establish that these addresses were the ones that predated the 1930 change, the problem then was I had to figure out what those addresses were now so that I would know when I'm out there videoing that I'm going to the right places. And fortunately, to my great benefit, records were kept, and specifically there was a massive list created, and it showed every single address change. It showed what the street was, what the address was before 1930, and what it became after 1930. And that was how I was able to figure that her 258 12th Avenue address had become 1146 Southwest 12th Street. And the same thing in terms of her 129 and a half address. I was able to figure out what the current address was for that. But that's something that's going to come up for you if you're trying to find out addresses that predated 1930. You gotta get the right information. And this is the first time that I ever actually had to utilize those old statistics that showed how everything is right now. And that was how I established where Una Munson lived in 1910. And that's how I was able to establish she lived right down the street, around the corner from Clark Gable, which is essentially what inspired this whole entire video. Now, I'll be the first to admit that my researching chops were not as strong back when I first covered this. I inferred that Una Munson was living at this one rooming house at the same time that Clark Gable was living just about 8 or 9 blocks north. However, Munson's Broadway career started in New York in June of 1919. One can assume by this time she'd probably permanently moved away from Portland, and this was some time before Clark arrived in town. However, while there's certainly charm and intrigue in the idea that these two were living in practically the same space at the same time, the greatest intrigue of all is the fact that these two individuals shared such a closeness in residences at all, only to come together nearly 20 years later and act opposite each other in one of America's greatest films.